Hello everyone and welcome to your week 6 lecture on undernutrition. So as always you have a couple of pre-reading slides which are from 4 to 12. So please have a read through. All right, they are very simple in nature. And now we'll start with the following slides for your lecture which I'll be discussing. So first is the integrated metabolism of carbohydrate, proteins and fats. So what is happening in the body in a fast and fed cycle is what we are going to be talking about. So there are 4 stages. Firstly, for instance, when you eat till 3 hours, it is called as the fed state. All right. Then the second state is an early fasting state, which is from 3 hours to approximately 18 hours. And then you have the fasting state, which is from 18 hours to 2 days. And then more than 2 days is called starvation. But if you see in generic layman terms, it's been 3 hours. And if we haven't eaten, what will we say? That we are starving. We are not actually starving. We don't starve until we haven't eaten anything for more than 2 days. That is when we have the right to say that we are starving. Otherwise, we are in an early fasting state. Generally, when we are in an early fasting state, that is when we tend to eat another meal. So for regular people like you and me, we generally have never experienced a starvation state per se. All right, so what's happening in the body? In the fed state, which is when you have eaten till 3 hours after you have eaten. So within that span, all right, so your zero baseline, which is when you have eaten till 3 hours, your fed state, what is happening? What are the metabolic changes which are happening? Now, this is all based upon nutritional biochemistry. So as I said in day 1 lecture, this unit is very heavily supplemented with biochem. So if you're not confident about these cycles, please go back to your nutritional biochemistry. All right, so for instance, when you have carbohydrates, what is happening to carbohydrates? Your glucose is getting converted to glycogen. All right, this is called as glycogenesis. Genesis meaning synthesis of something. All right, so yes, you have all of this extra glucose because you have eaten. Now this is getting converted to glycogen. Your glycogen is essentially stored in your livers and your muscle. All right, so your liver is the predominant site and then your muscles. Then you have free glucose molecules, which are provided to your central nervous system, red blood cells, and your brain because they cannot store energy. All right, they need a constant supply of energy and they need energy in form of glucose. Okay, so your brain will not store fat per se, all right, and then convert it into energy or something like that. It needs free glucose molecules for energy. All right, then once your glycogen stores are saturated, all of your body organs such as your brain and your RBC, so on and so forth, they all have their essential glucose which they need for energy production. Then all of the extra glucose will get converted into fat. So what is the biochemical pathway? Glucose to pyruvate, pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, acetyl-CoA to triglyceride, triglyceride stored in your adipose tissue. Okay, so this blue color highlight, that is your pathway of glucose being converted to fat. All right, so when glucose gets converted to fat, when all bodily needs are met, which is your your basal energy expenditure needs are met, all right, you do not have any more expenditure per se. So all of that extra energy intake or glucose intake is now being converted to fat. All right, so this is what is happening in a fed state, right? In a fed state with fat, what is happening? You have your dietary fat, okay, which you have eaten. It is transported via chylomicron in form of triglycerides, okay, and into the adipose tissue. Then you have endogenous fat production, your liver synthesizing the fat. All right, this fat which your liver synthesizes, it is transported in the blood in form of, say, lipoproteins. Your lipoproteins are essentially of your 4 types, which is your chylomicrons, VLDL, LDL, HDL. All right, so all of this gets, so you have, say, your blood fat. So you have fatty acids in your blood. All right, and they get transported to various body organs as needed. All the extra will again be stored in the adipose tissue. So again, in the end, with fat, you have dietary fat in fed state because you're eating that fat. Then you have synthesis of fat via your liver. All right, all of this extra fat after the body needs are met, they will be stored in the adipose tissue. With protein, what is happening? The protein which you're eating, it contributes to the amino acid pool. So it is not that you have a swimming pool in the body which has a lot of amino acids. It's not like that. But basically, all of the amino acid needs in the body are met for, say, wear and tear, muscle repair, tissue maintenance. Say, for example, growing your hair, skin, nails, growing WBC, RBC, hemoglobin, all of these needs, growing various body cells. So your protein, the protein which you eat is contributing to that. And as you know, with all of this, with fat and with protein, there are essential fatty acids, essential amino acids, which the body cannot synthesize. So it is relying upon your diet for you to have it in your diet. All right. So with all of these needs being met, then the extra protein will also be converted to fat. Okay. So during your fed state, you have a lot of transamination also happening. Transamination meaning your essential amino acid used for the synthesis of conditionally essential amino acid, non-essential amino acids, because they can be synthesized in the body, especially conditionally essential amino acids from your non-essential, from your essential amino acids. Okay, so all that transamination is happening, deamination is happening depending upon the metabolic pathway. But basically the body first completes your amino acid pool, because for your body to synthesize your tissue, cells, muscles, etc., it needs all essential amino acids, which is being supplemented in your diet. Okay, so once that happens, then extra protein will also be converted to fat. So what is the bottom story? Irrespective of the macronutrient source, your carbohydrate, protein, and fat, all right, will be converted to fat if not used. All right. So therefore, you will have, say, irrespective of the nutrient source, be it if you are on a ketogenic diet or an Atkins diet or whichever diet you are on, if you are not using those calories, it will be converted to fat. Okay, that is the bottom story. All right. So now in a early fasting state, which is from 3 hours and to approximately 18 hours, what is happening if you haven't eaten? All right. So then what is happening? First, your body's most preferred source of energy is carbohydrate. All right. And that is always going to remain the same. All right. So carbohydrate is the most preferred source of energy in everybody. Even if you have the top-notch athlete, the first source of energy which will be used is carbohydrate. But please remember, the for when I teach nutrition and disease, it is for the layman, it is for the average person, for a person who has the normal basic sedentary activities and say who's not a top-notch athlete. All right, because when you train your body, when you train your memory cells, okay, so memory cells meaning you don't have certain cells which are just for memory, but basically when you condition your body, which an athlete does, it starts using fat as its second preferred source of energy. But in a normal average person like you and me who are not top-notch athletes, the second preferred source of energy for us will be protein, and then our body will switch to fat. Okay, therefore a person like you and me who if starts crash dieting and things, we lose a lot of our muscle body mass, lean body mass. It is because our body is not conditioned to automatically start using fat after glucose as source of energy. This is not happening for us, the switch. For that switch to happen, you need to constantly train your body over a period of time. Then a memory develops in your body that she has or he has a caloric an energy expenditure to a particular level. And I should stop using protein for energy because this is her, say, continuous lifestyle. This is her level of energy expenditure. So once my carbohydrate stores are depleted, I will start using fat for energy. So building this muscle memory takes a very long time. It takes discipline. It takes consistency in your energy expenditure and output. Therefore, please remember, when you learn sports nutrition, you will be learning differently, differently, because fat will be the preferred source of energy after carbs. Over here for layman, you and me, not layman, but basically an average sedentary person who has, say, basic level of physical activity, this is what is happening in the body. Okay. So now with carbohydrate, the first thing which happens in an early fasting state is you have glycogen, which breaks down into glucose. Okay, so your liver source of your glycogen, they are depleted, they are exhausted. This is called as glycogenolysis. Lysis meaning breakdown, glyco meaning glycogen. All right, so glycogen being broken down into glucose. Then you have the second thing which is happening. Once your glycogenolysis is completed, you have no more glycogen stores to broken down into glucose. Then you have the activation of gluconeogenesis. Okay, neo meaning new, genesis meaning synthesis. So you have non-carbohydrate sources like your protein and fat, which are being taken and they are being converted to glucose. So when protein and fat in the body is converted to glucose, this is called as gluconeogenesis. All right. Okay. So now let us understand, after carbohydrate sources are depleted, all right, glycogenolysis is done, gluconeogenesis is started. Now what is happening? All right, so yes, your glycogen stores are depleted. Now what will happen is with your protein will be attacked for energy purposes in the body. All right, so you have your amino acids, they will be converted to carbon skeletons. Carbon skeletons are basically they come from amino acids, but they don't have the ammonia group anymore. They don't have the N molecule, the nitrogen molecule anymore, and therefore they are not called as amino acids. They are now called as carbon skeletons. So your alpha ketoglutarate, oxaloacetate, which are your metabolic compounds in your the TCA cycle, the tricarboxylic acid cycle, or Krebs cycle, or the energy producing cycle. This is called as, these are your carbon skeletons which enter these pathways. Okay, so protein, basically you have deamination of protein happening, meaning removal of the ammonia group. Okay, so deamination of protein calls for amino acid being converted to carbon skeletons, such as alpha ketoglutarate, oxaloacetate. These then enter the gluconeogenesis pathway, and then they enter the TCA pathway. All right. Then you have, for instance, a lot of nitrogen loss in the urine, and now you know why. It is because of the deamination process, removal of the ammonia group, because you want to convert amino acid to carbon skeleton. As I said, carbon skeleton, they do not have the amino group. So for this to happen, this process is called as deamination. All right. So guys, basically, this kind of thing is happening when individuals, they go on these crazy fat diets, okay, lemon crush diet and some cookie diet and whatever it is. Okay, so basically when you have these crazy diet, when you are suddenly starving your body and your body is not used to this sudden starvation, your body is like, why the hell is she doing this? Okay, this is not the regular thing that she does. Why she's suddenly starving? And if she's suddenly starving, the first thing that the body starts breaking down is protein, okay, which is a very, very expensive resource. All right, so why is protein a very expensive resource, guys? So let me just come over here. Okay, because your protein is the only thing in the body which can help to produce all of the other things in the body, such as your antibodies, your cells, your enzymes, your hormones. All of these are protein in nature. We ourselves are protein in nature. Our skin is protein, our nails are protein, our hair is protein, keratin, which we talk about. All right. So essentially, organically, we are protein in nature for the synthesis of everything in our body, be it internal things such as your cells, tissue, organ cells, hormones, enzymes, hemoglobin. All of this needs protein. Synthesis of your external structure like your hair, skin, nail, all of this also needs protein. So basically, we are little protein packages walking on the planet Earth. All right. So yes, that's why we need protein, and protein is such a vital nutrient for us that we do not want to use it for energy purposes. All right, we want to conserve it so that we can do the muscle wear and tear which happens in our body. Okay, so but yes, now when you have starvation state, okay, so when you have say more than 2 days and you are lost on an island and you have no food to eat, your carbohydrate sources are completely depleted, meaning no glycogen stores left to be converted to glucose. Your body after 2 days realizes, hang on, she's just not eating anything. I'm really, really starving. And because now your body says it's starving, okay, not before 2 days. So roughly say when it is greater than 2 days, more than 2 days, your body starts realizing that, okay, she's just not eating. There is something which is going wrong outside in the environment. Now let me start conserving this protein for all the essential things. What if your body thinks she's lost on an island and it's been more than 2 days, she's not eating? I need to preserve this protein. Why? Because just in case if I'm attacked by some sort of infection, bacteria, something, I need that protein to produce antibodies, to produce WBCs, to fight off whatever she may be experiencing. Okay, so after 2 days is when you actually start preserving your protein and you start using fat for your energy purposes. Okay, this is when we are talking about complete starvation state. So now with fat, what happens? And I think I may have highlighted this several times, especially in the diabetes lecture, that dealing with fat is like making a deal with the devil. Fat will say, yeah, sure, I can like be used for energy purposes, but I will give byproducts which are called as ketone bodies. So now imagine you are in a complete state of starvation. You have ketone bodies which are generated. So you have ketoacidosis, all right, meaning your blood is saturated with ketone bodies. Once your blood is saturated with ketone bodies, this is all coming out in the urine. So you have high ketone bodies in the urine. And as I said, when your blood is completely saturated with urine, no, hang on. When your blood is completely saturated with ketone bodies, this will cross the blood-brain barrier. Ketone bodies will enter your brain. This will start causing these neurocognitive symptoms, okay, where you feel dizzy, where you feel, say, irritated, where you have loss of, say, memory, and you feel agitated and you have headaches. Of course, with the blood high in ketone, you'll have cramps, you'll have, say, abdominal pain, and all of those symptoms which we spoke about in the diabetes lecture. Okay, so yes, your fat is broken down for energy. So fat to acyl-CoA to acetyl-CoA, acetyl-CoA entering your TCA cycle. And you know that fat can also enter the gluconeogenesis pathway to give you glucose. And this glucose can help to increase your blood sugar level, or it can enter the TCA cycle. Okay, so fat broken down to acyl-CoA, acetyl-CoA, pyruvate, oxaloacetate, glucose. Okay, but as you know, you have a lot of ketone bodies generation as well. And the glucose is not produced to that state where even if you're starving, you will not experience hypoglycemia. No, the main priority of your body in a starvation state is to give ATP to generate energy. So your fat will essentially be used for generation of energy. Why? Because it wants to maintain your basic metabolic level. Okay, so the energy which is needed for all of your metabolic functioning, such as your pumping of your heart and the working of your lungs and the working of your brain, all of this needs some basic level of energy, which is called as your basic metabolic rate. So to maintain that basic metabolic rate, your fat will be taken for energy rather than it just increasing your blood sugar levels. So in a starvation state, when you will, for example, if a blood test is done, the person is very likely to see hypoglycemia, meaning you do not have a lot of blood sugar levels. Why? Because the fat was essentially taken in the metabolic pathway to maintain your basic body functioning. Why? Because this is important, so that when protein wants to, for protein to generate tissue, WBC, RBC, that requires energy. So there is this ATP available for your body to do the basic metabolic functioning. All right. So yes, you have your ketone bodies generation. And as we know that if this keeps continuing, if you just do not have any source of carbohydrate because you're lost on an island, this ultimately can lead to ketoacidosis, it can lead to coma, it can lead to death as well. All right. So this is what you studied in your obesity lecture, your diabetes lecture. All right. Okay, so yes, basically guys, with athletes, what happened, they have carbohydrate loading phases. Okay, so they have, for example, even if they are on a, say, ketogenic diet, okay, so these kind of things, athletes may be on these specific type of diets, but they always make sure that they have carbohydrate loading phases as well to replenish their glycogen depleted stores, okay, because that is going to give that instant source of energy during performance. All right. So yes, please do not compare yourself to an athlete, because they Their dietary management is very, very different. They have carbohydrate loading phases, and they have higher protein requirements, so on and so forth. Please understand this lecture in terms of a average person and what is happening to an average person. Okay, because students who take sports nutrition in their undergraduate degree and who take nutrition and disease, sometimes they get confused. But when I explain them that that is for athletes, that is for somebody who's training and who has higher metabolic needs compared to an average person, then the idea becomes clear. Okay, so I hope you can appreciate that this is for the average person. All right. So roughly speaking, for a 70 kg man, these are the metabolic fuels in the body, which is 15 kg of fat can give you around so many calories. All right. Protein can give you so many calories, and glycogen, they are the tiniest source, but the quickest sources of energy. They can give you so many calories. So basically, yes, what this diagram shows is that, yes, when you burn fat for energy, this can give you the highest energy output. Okay. But unfortunately and hypothetically speaking, let's first go to the hypothetical situation and then the unfortunate situation. So yes, if you are lost on an island, but if human beings could say utilize fat for energy and not worry about ketone bodies, then what would happen for a individual with a say healthy BMI, a regular individual, they could survive on a lost island for at least minimum of 3 months by using fat as their source of energy. If you had an overweight or obese individual who's lost on an island, okay, they could survive for at least 1 year by burning fat for their energy, and therefore their basic metabolic functioning are all taken care of. Basic metabolic functioning, remember, that means like beating of your heart, working of your brain and lungs and all of that. Okay, because we need that basic level of energy. That's why even on a low calorie, a very low calorie diet, you are still having some calories. It is not that you're having 0 calories. You may be having say around 600 to 800 calories even on a very low calorie diet. Why? Because you need that level of energy intake for your basic metabolic functioning. So yes, if we could essentially utilize fat effectively and not worry about ketone bodies, this is how we could survive even without eating for a longer duration. But as you know now, this will always remain hypothetical because human bodies, they cannot say break down ketone bodies. Okay, so we pee it out in the urine, but we can't say destroy those ketone bodies which are being generated, these excessive ketone bodies, and therefore we cannot effectively utilize fat for energy purposes. All right, so yes, it is for athletes, they may be say in a ketotic state, meaning they may be having high ketone bodies for a certain level of time, but again they come down to the normal level, which is they have their carbohydrate loading phase, so they are never on a high ketotic state for a prolonged period of time. Okay, so they always have their management is such where they go up and down because of their carbohydrate loading phase, and then you have protein loading phases, then again carbohydrate loading phases. So their body functioning is very different. Okay, so I hope this is understandable, guys, and this is what happens in your say metabolic state of fasting and feasting. Okay, so I hope this is clear. All right, now going on to a more say public health sort of a topic, all right, which is more generic in nature, which is your undernutrition interventions in developing countries, undernutrition interventions in developed countries, the basic interventions which are say provided by Centrelink or Meals on Wheels or Oz Harvest, things like that. The general information was there in your pre-readings. Okay, so now let's look at undernutrition interventions which are provided in developing countries, okay, which are seen to be most successful in addressing undernutrition in developing countries. All right, so what has been seen is that the nutrition interventions which have shown to be most successful in addressing undernutrition, all right, among say women and children who are the most vulnerable group. And when we are talking about child, it is covering their first 1,000 days, okay. So yes, till 2 years of age. All right, so 1,000 days covering pregnancy and the child first 2 years. So the interventions which have seen to be most successful are, for example, like micronutrient supplementation during pregnancy and adolescent, all right, period, so that the child who's born is healthy. Then you have interventions during birth, such as promotion of exclusive breastfeeding. All right, these sort of interventions have been shown to be most successful, all right, during in a developing country setting. Now, a review was done by Lancet, and Lancet is one of the most prestigious journal. And what they saw was that rather than investing money in, say, building one neonatal ICU center in a, say, in a rural area, that was shown to not save as many lives as, say, the ground level basic education, nutrition education. So basically, when, for example, the mothers and children were taught about importance of, say, micronutrient supplementation in pregnancy, because they essentially enter pregnancy undernourished, they enter pregnancy young, they enter pregnancy when they are, say, adolescent, right? So during this time, when they were encouraged to have micronutrient supplements, maybe in form of, say, governmental programs, all right, so this was shown to save many more lives than just having a sophisticated one neonatal ICU center, which did not save as many lives as educating people at a grassroots level. Okay, so the other intervention which was shown to save a lot more lives in a, say, developing country context was promotion of breastfeeding. All right, exclusive breastfeeding in the first 6 months, and then mixed feeding, which is continue breastfeeding with complementary foods. All right, so promotion of breastfeeding was seen to save much more lives in the context of undernutrition, and simple basic techniques, hygiene techniques such as, say, hand washing, teaching how to hand wash properly in a developing country setting saved many more lives, such as, say, using of iodized salt saved many more lives, because in, say, developing countries where you have, especially in the Himalayan belt, where you have iodine deficiency, for instance, iodized salt is, say, mandated by the government. Okay, so, and salt, even in a developing country, is a very, very cheap, affordable commodity. So having something like this was seen to save many lives. Okay, so this is what I want to say, that at a grassroots level, at an epidemiological level, or at a population level, when you're talking about, these are the sort of interventions which, when advocated, promoted, were seen to address undernutrition in an effective manner. Okay, so this is, guys, just showing you this. The first table is showing you the death rate, which was reduced because of, say, these sort of these sort of interventions, say, general nutrition interventions such as, say, iodine fortification, use of iodine fortification salt, or the hand washing technique, or so those were the disease control, the hand washing technique, disease control intervention, micronutrient intervention such as micronutrient supplementation, okay, meaning having those iron fortified and folic acid tablets, which the governmental is prescribing and giving at a subsidized rate or free within the tribal and the rural areas. Okay, so these interventions have shown to save many, many more lives in a long run. Okay, at 12 months, 24 months, and 36 months. Now, the second graph over here is telling you the importance of exclusive breastfeeding within a developing nation. So infants who were exclusively breastfed, they are this dark blue in color. Infants partially breastfed, and infants not breastfed at all. Okay, and this is between 0 to 5 months. Okay, so now if you see the dark blue color, and if we see, this is the relative risk. Okay, and incidence rate versus mortality rate. So incidence rate is when you have a newly diagnosed case of pneumonia. Okay, so that is called as the incidence rate. A newly diagnosed case of infant suffering from diarrhea. Okay, mortality is death rate. Okay, so infants who have died because of diarrhea, infants who have died because of pneumonia. So if you see, if infants were exclusively breastfed, all right, they were only one time at higher risk of dying because of pneumonia. Similarly, infants who were partially breastfed, all right, they were 2 times at higher risk of dying because of pneumonia. Infants who were not breastfed at all, they were 15 times at higher risk of dying because of pneumonia compared to their other counterparts, which is, say, your infants exclusively breastfed and infants partially breastfed. So this is how this graph is interpreted. Okay, it is in relative risk ratio, which is an epidemiological term, but basically this 15 to 1, this means times. Okay, they are 15 times at higher risk of dying because of, say, pneumonia in comparison to their counterparts, which is say partially breastfed and infants not breastfed. Okay, so this is how these graphs can be interpreted. This is, guys, just an FYI, and this is something which is covered generally in food science. Okay, it is not part of, say, diet disease relationship in nutrition, so I cannot go into the details of this. This is basically when you have vitamin A deficiency, what is the outcome of vitamin A deficiency? Or else if you have folate deficiency, what is the outcome of folate deficiency? So when you're spoken about, say, macro and micronutrients in food science, that is where this is covered. So for example, vitamin A deficiency leads to xerophthalmia. You have, say, your B3 deficiency, niacin, leads to pellagra. All right, and then we even spoke about thiamine deficiency. One of the thing over here is beriberi, but I spoke about thiamine deficiency in your diabetes, in your liver lecture, where I said when you have micronutrient deficiency in say individuals with liver conditions, especially when you have B complex deficiency, and particularly of thiamine, your B1 vitamin, one of the classic sign of which is seen in alcoholic individuals is you have Wernicke-Kornikov encephalopathy. Okay, so Wernicke-Kornikov encephalopathy is to do with thiamine deficiency, where you have pinpricking sensations, because these are neurological associated deficiencies. So these type of deficiencies are generally taught in food science, but I just wanted to increase your awareness that micronutrient deficiency is very closely associated with undernutrition, all right, in a developing country context. Okay, so you have a lot of vitamin A supplementation program, you have fortification programs in developing countries to address these micronutrient deficiencies. Okay, so for example, you have the woman and infant iron and folic acid supplementation program, which is a big governmental program which is supported by the UNICEF in, say, India, in say all over Asia basically. All right, so this program is where adolescents are given a supplement of iron and folic acid free of cost within school setting, so that because culturally in those countries they get married very soon, so at least they are entering conception and pregnancy with a balanced micronutrient status. All right, and a few of these you are covering as part of your say oral presentation as well, such as, say, for example, the iodine goiter. You are speaking about this as part of your oral presentation. Okay, now we go on to protein energy malnutrition, where you have, there are two types of protein energy malnutrition seen in children. You have kwashiorkor and marasmus. So kwashiorkor is protein only malnutrition. Marasmus is protein and energy malnutrition. Malnutrition meaning undernutrition, meaning they are deficient in protein, they are deficient in protein and energy. Kwashiorkor is generally seen in children who are 1 to 5 years of age. So basically, if you have two children, so the older child is where you will see kwashiorkor, because when you have the younger child being born, the older child is weaned off of breast milk, which was the essential source of protein. Now they are weaned off on family foods, which are, say, just simply rich in carbohydrate, not really having any protein in their diet. That is when they start showing symptoms of kwashiorkor. In marasmus, this is both protein and energy malnutrition. This is seen in children younger than 1 year of age. All right, so 1 year of age. So that is your marasmus. Then if you see, marasmus is the child being literally say turned into skin and bones. Okay, so it looks like a tiny little skeleton, unfortunately. So they are severely say stunted. All right, then if you see their weight for age, if you're plotting their weight for age on a growth chart, marasmus, they have, say, less than 60% of the recommended weight for age. So their weight, which should be according to their age, according to the, say, regular normal growth chart at an epidemiological scale, they are less than 60% of their age. Whereas weight for age for kwashiorkor is, say, around 60 to 80% of their age. All right, now guys, very important in kwashiorkor, you look at the dry weight. Why you look at the dry weight? Meaning the weight minusing the fluid retention in the body. All right, so fluid retention is in the form of edema. So edema is fluid retention in your hands and feet. Why do you have edema in the first case in kwashiorkor? Because it is protein malnutrition. If you remember your liver lecture, I spoke about when you have, say, oncotic imbalance. So it is type of an osmosis, but it is, you have an osmosis, you have osmotic imbalance because of protein is called as oncotic imbalance. So when you have protein deficiency, you have, say, less solute, all right, and you have more water which is being retained. Okay, therefore they have edema. You have hypoalbuminemia, okay, meaning you're in, say in kwashiorkor, your liver functioning is affected, so you have less synthesis of the protein albumin by your liver, and therefore you have edema, because as we have seen in the liver lecture, when you have hypoalbuminemia, one of your classic signs and symptoms is edema. All right, you have hair discoloration, particularly because of micronutrient deficiency such as vitamin A and zinc, okay, within kwashiorkor. Then you have fatty liver. So now guys, why do you have fatty liver? It is again because of poor synthesis of proteins, all right, such as your lipoproteins. So your alpha and your beta proteins, which are needed for the transportation of fat, which is being synthesized in the liver into the blood, is not done properly. So you have so you have impairment of albumin synthesis by the liver because your liver is not functioning well. Therefore, hypoalbuminemia, you have impaired functioning of your alpha and beta proteins, which make up your lipoproteins, which are important in carrying the fat from the liver to various other cells in the body, or for its deposition as adipose tissue, or for carrying blood in for carrying a fat into the blood. So as I said, your lipoproteins are of 4 types: chylomicrons, VLDL, LDL, HDL. All right. So when you have deficiency in the synthesis of lipoproteins, so the proteins which carry fat from your liver to your blood, when you have deficiency of these proteins, that is when you have a fatty liver in kwashiorkor. Okay. So again, fatty liver is because of protein deficiency in very simple terms. All right, then you have pot belly. Why do you have pot belly? Because of water retention in your abdomen. And now you know why do you have water retention in your abdomen, edema in your abdomen. This is because of protein deficiency. Okay, so one of the classic thing is when you have protein deficiency, you have edema and you have fatty liver in kwashiorkor. And one of the classic signs which they have is that face is very round and puffy. So it looks like a moon face. All right. And again, that is because of all the fluid retention. All right. Now in marasimus, you do not have edema symptoms. You do not have hypoalbuminemia symptoms because the liver is not affected as much. You do not have hair discoloration, but basically you have excessive loss of your muscle mass, lean body mass. So the child is reduced to skin and bones. Okay, so you have great depletion of your subcutaneous fat. All right, and the symptom is called as monkey face. That is because you have very less fat even on your face. So therefore you have your cheeks which are sunken in and things like that. All right. So now guys, this is how it looks. So this is a kwashiorkor, a child suffering from kwashiorkor. So because the child looks very round and that is all just fluid retention, therefore the mother thinks that the child is very healthy, the child is round and plumpy, but no, the child is actually protein malnourished. All right. This is a child suffering from marasimus, where the child is reduced to skin and bones. Okay, so very skinny looking child. All right. So therefore, for these individuals, you have a lot of, again, you have these WHO sort of programs which are going on, which give you these, say, feeds which are high in energy, protein. These are called as your ready to eat infant supplements. So basically, they are your RTFs, ready to RTF. So ready to eat foods. So basically they come in pouches like how you have in Coles and Woolworths, those yogurt pouches. So in these pouches, you have basically lots of peanut paste and you have oils. So basically these paste, they are high in your say protein and energy and micronutrients like vitamin A, zinc, so on and so forth. And basically the child has to eat that so that the child say recovers from this protein and energy malnutrition deficiency. All right. So So basically, guys, again, now the fortification and the supplementation program around these children, that is not part of this unit. That is very global public health sort of a, say, content. Therefore, it is not covered in this lecture. All right. So now moving further, guys, you have clinical guidelines around, say, identification of undernutrition, which generally is termed as malnutrition. But if you know your pre-readings, as I said, technically malnutrition means both things, overnutrition and undernutrition. Over here, when I say clinical guidelines for malnutrition, it is particularly to do with undernutrition. All right. So these guidelines were recently published in 2018. This is called as the Global Leadership Initiative on Malnutrition. All right. So how do you identify, say, undernutrition? Okay. So basically, this is the assessment which is done. This is generally done, guys, for, say, inpatients. So patients who are there in the hospital and who may be at a risk of undernutrition. This is the screening protocol which is followed. All right. So we are basically talking more in terms of, say, hospital associated malnutrition or undernutrition. Okay, so screening over here is you use a appropriate validated screening tool for assessing if the patient is at risk of malnutrition or not. All right, so what is the type of screening tool you use? We'll be looking into that in your couple of other slides. After the rough screening, which you do the paper-based screening, then you do a diagnostic assessment. In diagnostic assessment, you have a phenotype and you have an etiological assessment. So phenotype, for example, it is where you see that you have, say, the individual has a lot of weight, and those are, say, involuntary losses, meaning it is not that the individual wanted to lose weight, but the individual lost weight, a lot of their weight because of, say, maybe secondary disease condition, something like that. But individual has, say, involuntary lost a lot of weight. Then you have low BMI. Okay, so your low body mass index is what you take into consideration with the phenotype assessment, and you have reduced muscle mass. So the reduced muscle mass can be identified using techniques such as, say, bioelectrical impedance, DEXA, all right, things like that, or else skin calipers. All right, then you have the etiological assessment, where you take a dietary assessment to look at if they have a reduced food intake, all right, or else assimilation issues. Assimilation meaning their food intake is okay, but they have malabsorption issues. So they are not absorbing the amount of nutrients which they need to from their food. Okay. Then you have, say, if they have any underlying disease condition. Okay, so any secondary condition, any disease condition which is increasing their metabolic rate because they are catabolic in condition. So catabolic disease condition are things such as inflammatory disease conditions such as, say, pancreatitis, and say you have cirrhosis. So things, say, which are inflammatory in condition, if they have any secondary disease, that can increase their, say, weight loss, say, energy requirements, but they are not meeting those energy requirements by their intake. They may be having a lot of muscle mass because of the inflammatory condition. So that is your etiological assessment. Then with your diagnostic, say, criteria, if they meet at least one of the phenotype assessment and one of the etiological assessment, then they meet the diagnostic criteria for being classified as malnourished. And then the degree of malnourishment, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, something like that, that depends upon the severity of their phenotype and etiological assessment. All right. So I hope this makes sense, guys. These are the clinical guidelines. And this is, I won't go into each numbers of these, and you also don't have to remember each numbers, but do remember what does phenotype criteria entail. It entails weight loss, it entails low body mass index, BMI, and reduced muscle mass. Etiological assessment, it entails two things, which is reduced food intake and any sort of underlying disease burden, which is inflammatory in nature. Okay, depending upon this, they are classified as moderately malnourished or severely malnourished, which is stage 1, stage 2. Okay, and depending upon the weight loss which they have had, BMI which they have, and reduced muscle mass which they have, because these are very easily quantifiable. Based upon this, they will be classified as moderately to severely malnourished. Okay, guys, so basically that is about, say, the clinical guidelines which have been recently released in the, say, literature for, say, diagnosis of undernutrition, malnutrition. So we are, as I have said, we are talking about hospital-based malnutrition. All right, and guys, please remember, hospital-based malnutrition is not always, but generally seen among our geriatric patients. So geriatric patients are elderly individuals. Okay, so individuals who are older, aged individuals, when they come to the hospital, they are very likely to come to the hospital in a malnourished state or in an undernourished state because of several socio-ecological determinants. There is no one to take care of themselves. It is difficult for them to cook for themselves. Okay, mobility has reduced, things like that. Okay, so when a patient such as a undernourished or malnourished patient comes to the hospital, they generally come with these signs and red flags, meaning they have a lot of muscle mass, cachexia, and I'll tell you what is cachexia in the next slide. They have reduced mobility. Okay, they are at a high risk of thrombolism, which is when you have your tiny blood vessels, which may be say obstructed because of a blood clot. All right, then you have they are at high risk of bed sores because of reduced mobility. They have impaired immunity. All right, they are at a high risk of depression or mental health conditions and loss of appetite. So they come with these red flags. Okay, so when you see these sort of red flags in an individual, you then go and you do the proper risk screening of malnutrition assessment. Okay, so now guys, let me first tell you the difference between cachexia and sarcopenia. As this is because this is particularly, as I said, we see this a lot in our geriatric population. So sarcopenia is when you have a lot of muscle mass, lean muscle mass. The individual is say reducing to skin and bones. Okay, so looking very skeleton types, but you do not have inflammation. Okay, in cachexia, the biggest difference between cachexia and sarcopenia is in cachexia, you have inflammation. All right. So over here, for instance, let me see if I have used the right terminology. Okay, so guys, yes. So in marasmus, basically you see a lot of muscle wasting, right? As I said, the child is reduced to skin and bones. So you see a lot of muscle wasting, which is happening in marasmus. So basically the children are very sarcopenic in nature. Okay, so they have say a lot of muscle mass loss, but this is a nutrient deficient condition. Okay, so they have nutrient deficiency, which is protein deficiency. They do not have a disease condition because of why they are losing muscle mass. Because they do not have underlying disease condition at this stage, they only have a nutrient deficiency, which is protein deficiency. They are generally sarcopenic in nature, meaning they do not have inflammatory bodies in their blood. Okay, but now coming to this point, when you have a cachexic individual, okay, over here the individual is reduced to skin and bones, but the biggest thing over here is when you do a blood test, you will see inflammatory markers in their blood, particularly your T cell associated inflammatory markers such as your tumor necrosis factor and your C-reactive protein. C-reactive protein, very big biomarker of inflammation. All right. So in a cachexic individual, meaning when you are losing your muscle mass, your lean body mass, because of a underlying disease condition, this is called as cachexia. Okay, so this underlying disease condition could be any sort of inflammatory condition. Okay, such as say your advanced stages of cancer, AIDS, other chronic conditions such as pancreatitis, cirrhosis. Okay, so these kind of conditions are called as say your cachexic condition. These are catabolic condition, guys. Catabolic condition meaning you're losing a lot of your lean muscle mass. They're going to lead to a lot more of protein breakdown than protein synthesis. When you have a lot more of protein breakdown and less protein synthesis, this is called as a catabolic condition. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So yep, so you have, so as I said in marasmus, yes, you have protein losses, but in cachexia, the protein losses is much, much more than what you see in marasmus. Marasmus, essentially, you have protein deficiency because the children are not being fed protein. Okay, it is literally a state of starvation. All right, so you see this particularly, say in for example, developing countries, underdeveloped say regions such as Ethiopia. All right, or say in very rural villages of India, okay, where you may see marasmus. All right, now the risk factors for cachexia is, for example, you have medications, chemotherapy, which causes a lot of, say, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, loss of appetite. So energy intake is compromised. Because of medication, chemotherapy, you have altered taste sensation, smell sensation. Okay, therefore you do not feel like eating food. So basically you have less energy intake, all right, more energy expenditure, therefore high risk of cachexia. Malabsorption, as I said, even if you're eating, you're not absorbing a lot of nutrient, therefore high risk of cachexia. You have increased, say, resting metabolic rate or your basal metabolic rate for your involuntary activities, therefore increase energy expenditure but decrease energy intake. Okay, but remember, the biggest risk factor is that you have high inflammatory, there is a underlying secondary disease condition. Therefore, you have inflammatory bodies, and inflammation in turn leads to a loss of breakdown of lean muscle mass, and therefore cachexia within these individuals. So in these individuals, inflammation is actually leading to a lot of breakdown of your lean muscle mass. That, as I said, is because their underlying disease condition is catabolic in nature. Then, for example, you may even see, you could likely to be see cachexia even in patients which are suffering from burns, traumas, because it is a catabolic condition. Okay, but whether they have inflammation or not, it depends upon case by case basis. But the key golden examples where you see cachexia is when you have inflammatory disease conditions such as cancer, AIDS, and pancreatitis. All right. Okay, guys, these are the malnutrition screening tools which I wanted to refer. So I'll just show that to you quickly. You see over here, risk assessment, screening using validated tools. So these are the type of tools which are available. For example, this is called a subjective global assessment. And those who are taking Masters of Nutrition and Dietetics in the future, you will be taught more about these things. Okay, so basically these are the type of hospital screening tools which are available. So I used to use this tool when I was working in the Royal Brisbane Hospital in Brisbane. Okay, that is where we used to use the subjective global assessment. Then you have specific other sort of validated tools. Basically, it helps you to identify whether the patient is malnourished or not and at which grade of malnourishment. Okay, but then you need more diagnostic criteria. You can't just rely on this one simple paper-based test. And the benefit over here in Australia is that dietitians, they have the right to identify and diagnose a patient as malnourished or not, okay, or undernourished or not. Therefore, it is important for dietitians to learn how to correctly identify and diagnose a patient as malnourished, like how a doctor will diagnose if a patient has, say, pancreatitis or not. You have the right to diagnose whether the patient is suffering from malnourishment or not. All right. So that's why this has its own importance. Now, guys, what is the nutritional management around individuals who are suffering from malnutrition within the hospital setting again? So you have three modes of nutritional support which are provided. So guys, this diagram just tells you that if you have a BMI of less than 18.5, you are at very high risk of, say, malnutrition, and therefore you need nutritional support. All right. So over here, for example, you have nutritional support in form of oral supplementation, enteral feeds, parenteral feeds. Now, those who are learning dietetics, you will be learning enteral and parenteral feeds extensively in detail. I'm just going to introduce the topic to you, but not going to go into the details because it's not required for this unit, okay, and this subject. So now, guys, three modes of feeds. You have oral. Oral, as the name suggests, you just drink the supplement, okay, or the supplement is in a powder form. You mix it in milk or in water or something like that and you drink it. Okay, this is how your oral supplements look. They look like these things. The most basic oral supplement which you have, which is also available in Coles and Woolworths, is something like Sustagen. Okay, and some of these even have, say, Ensure Pro powders. Okay, so these are, say, your supplements which have, say, higher level of protein and energy and micronutrients. So basically, if a patient is not really suffering a lot of, it's not at a grade 3 or grade, say, 4 level of undernutrition, then generally oral supplements are prescribed, especially for a lot of outpatients. Oral supplements are prescribed, such as the powder form or the liquid form. Even something simple as Sustagen is prescribed, where you may encourage them to mix it with skim milk or else if they need high energy and high protein requirement, then you may ask them to mix it with, say, whole milk and to have these supplements. Okay, then enteral feeds are when you're using your gastrointestinal tract. When you're using your gastrointestinal tract to any capacity, then it is called as enteral nutrition. All right. So now remember, guys, the basic rule for nutrition and dietetics is that if your gut is working, you will first try to use your gut. Okay, meaning your GI tract. So now enteral feeds, depending upon what part of your say gastrointestinal tract is working, your enteral feed route will be designed in that manner. For example, you may have nasogastric tube where you are eliminating things going from the mouth because maybe the individual has, say, oral cancer, or has, say ulcerations in the mouth for some reason why you cannot use the mouth. Therefore, you may use nasogastric tube. Sometimes you may have, say, a cancer of the esophagus and you cannot use the esophagus anymore. Then you may have tube which is directly inserted in the stomach. If, say, you have ulcerations, you have gastric ulcerations, okay, then you may insert the tube in the duodenum, all right, nasoduodenal tube. Say, for example, if you have duodenal ulcers as well, so then you may use, say, jejunal tubes, nasojejunal tubes, or else you may have tube which is directly inserted in the jejunum. Okay, so the part of the intestine or the GI tract which you use, it all depends upon the type of, say, the basically whatever is functioning and working in the body. All right. Then you have parenteral nutrition. There are two types. You have partial parenteral nutrition and total parenteral nutrition. Partial parenteral nutrition is generally inserted intravenous, guys. So it is inserted over here. Okay. And that is when a part of your needs can be met via enteral nutrition or oral nutrition, and part of your needs are met via partial parenteral nutrition. Okay. So there is, say, a 60-40, 70-30 combination like that, depending upon what the clinical case is. Total parenteral nutrition is used when you have majority of your needs, or your needs are only met via the parenteral side, meaning the nutrients are directly inserted in the blood. So with parenteral nutrition, the nutrients are directly inserted in the blood, be it partial parenteral or total parenteral. Now in total parenteral nutrition, you may use the subclavian veins, okay, and it directly, which is a big vein. So you can say insert a lot of nutrient via your subclavian vein. Okay, so that is when you use total parenteral nutrition. All right, so now remember, guys, because with parenteral nutrition, you're inserting nutrients directly in the blood. So you will not give intact proteins. You will not give, say, fibers. You will not give intact, say, carbohydrates. Okay, so you will not have oligosaccharides in your feed. You will not have, say, intact proteins in your feed, and you will not have, say, lipids in form of, say, the whole package like in the feeds. Basically, what you will be having is glucose, amino acids, and free fatty acids. Okay, this is what you will have in your parenteral nutrition. Okay, they are in its most elemental form. They are in the form where once you do your digestion and absorption, the way the nutrients are released in the blood, that is what you want to be inserting in your blood. You the patient can die if you're going to insert in intact proteins and things, because who's going to break down that protein? The protein is directly in the blood. Okay, so your parenteral nutrition is made up in a way where it is all only elemental nutrients which are provided. Okay, so guys, this is this packet over here on the top right corner. Look at my mouse. So this is your, say, parenteral nutrition. So the one which is, say, which looks opaque in nature, that is generally your lipids, because lipids are generally opaque in nature. Okay, then you have, say, you have one row for, say, lipids, you have one row for carbohydrates, and one row for your fats, okay, so proteins. So you have three of these, and depending upon what the patient need, you may either give them only carbohydrate, or you may give them carbohydrate with fat, or you may give them carbohydrate and protein, depending upon what they need. So this is what a parenteral nutrition pack looks like, and these are what enteral feeds look like. Okay, so enteral feeds, as I said, where you're using your GI tract. Okay, so now the type of enteral and parenteral feeds which are available. So parenteral, please remember, it is only, as I said, elemental nutrition. Okay, but the caloric value can be adjusted and modified depending upon what the need is. So now guys, the type of nutritional supplemental formulas which you have, and now this is pertaining to your enteral feeds. Okay, this could be say modular supplements. Modular supplement, they are calorically dense enteral feeds, meaning they have say 3 to 4 kilocal per ml. Okay, meaning you want to give concentrated feeds, you do not want to give a lot of fluid. So this is generally given to patients who have a lot of fluid restriction, okay, in their regime, all right, because they have a lot of water retention maybe. All right, so in these cases, when you have fluid restriction, that is when you give modulated feeds, modular feeds. All right, these are not complete sources of nutrition. Okay, they may have only carbohydrates, only proteins, or only fats. So something like, say, if you see your parenteral feeds, only carbohydrate, only protein, only fat. Similarly, with modular supplements, for enteral roots, you may have, say, only one of the nutrient source, but please remember the main thumb rule for modular supplement is that they are high in calorie. Okay, so they are 3 to 4 kilocal per ml. Then you have polymetric feeds. Generally, your enteral nutrition, which is available widely in the hospital and it is given to a lot of patients generally, they are your polymeric feeds. The polymeric feeds are your complete nutrition package. They have your carbohydrate, protein, fat, and your macro and micronutrients. And a lot of feeds also have fiber. Okay, so this, you cannot have polymeric parenteral feeds. Does that make sense? Because with polymeric feeds, because they are intact proteins, all right, they may have fibers and things. So therefore, you cannot have parenteral feeds which are polymeric in nature. All right, you need to have elemental nutrients in your parenteral feeds. Okay, so yes, polymeric is generally what is available widely in the hospital. Then you have elemental feeds. Your elemental feeds, they are your pre-digested or hydrolyzed feeds, meaning where you have say nutrients in its elemental form, like amino acids, free fatty acids, or free glucose. All right. So now this again, you have both. You have enteral feeds which are elemental in nature. Parenteral feeds are always elemental in nature. When would you have enteral feeds which are elemental in nature? When you have issues with digestion and absorption. Okay, so to make it easy, you want to give elemental feeds to the patient. Then you have disease specific feeds. So disease specific feeds are feeds where, for example, they are designed particularly say for a renal patient. Okay, so now a disease specific feed for a renal patient will be low in potassium, low in phosphorus, low in sodium. Why? Because you have electrolyte restriction in a renal feed, all right, because your kidney is not working well, it is not throwing out all of these extra electrolytes well. Okay, so these are electrolyte restricted feed. Or else you may have liver feeds, which, for example, they may be low in sodium and they may be say very high in their say energy content. Okay, so they why? Because liver is a catabolic condition and you need that high amount of energy. So these are very disease specific feeds. These are very expensive. So for you to use these feeds in a hospital setting, you need to make a justification case to your say senior manager as to why you need disease specific feeds. This particularly happens in public hospital, which is more budgeted. Okay, where you may need to justify. Otherwise, otherwise a lot of permutation combinations are done with polymetric feeds, which are widely used in the hospital setting. All right, so now guys, if you cannot see this diagram clearly, please rest assured because all of the references are provided in the notes section of this PowerPoint slide. So this is just to tell you the thing which I told you is that when the gut is functioning, the first rule is to use the gut. All right. Then if the gut is functioning and if oral intake can be facilitated, meaning the person can eat or something, then let the person eat and have oral supplements like your Sustagen and Ensure and things like that. If your needs cannot be met only via oral intake, by oral supplements or by food, then consider enteral nutrition. Then the type of feeds which needs to be considered is what I have explained in detail over here. Okay, so all of this, when you be using a hydrolyzed feed compared to a renal formula, disease specific feed, or a high energy formula, meaning when you have say high energy requirements versus say when you have high protein needs, these are the type of things you would consider depending upon what is happening in the body. Okay, so as I said, again, this is more clinical nutrition in nature. And this is where I'll stop with the feeds because you don't need further details than this. Okay, and remember, parenteral nutrition may be indicated when you cannot use the gut. When you cannot use the gut, that is when you want to insert nutrient directly into the blood. Please remember, whatever is inserted in the blood, it is in its most elemental form because there is no digestion absorption happening in the blood. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, guys. All right, guys. So yes, today's lecture was nice, short and crisp. Okay, so not a very big lecture. Next lecture will be on bone health and that will be recorded soon. But I'll see all of you in your tutorials. So this week we have oral presentation. So this week and the next week we have oral presentation. But rest assured, I have Kahoot quizzes which are developed for bone health and things like that. So you will be having a Kahoot quiz as self-study items. So you can always practice those quiz in your time. All right, which will help you prepare for your mid-semester exam. All right, so yes, guys, that's it from my end. And I'll see you very soon in the tute. Thank you.